There is a map locked in the deep archives of the Department of the Interior, dated 1938, that shows a roaring river in the Pacific Northwest suddenly vanishing. It does not dry up. It does not divert into a reservoir. The blue ink of the topography simply ends in a blank white void. Beside this void is a single handwritten note scrawled in the margins. Project abandoned by order of the Secretary. Seal the trench. In the 1930s, America was obsessed with conquering nature. Desperate to drag the country out of the Great Depression, the government choked the greatest rivers on the continent with millions of tons of concrete. We built monuments to our own power in the form of massive, curving dams. But in a remote gorge on the border of Idaho and Oregon, the men who moved mountains dug too deep. They reached the ancient solid bedrock of the earth, and then they broke through it. What they found behind the stone was not dirt. It was not an underground cavern. It was a wall, a perfectly smooth, impossibly ancient barrier. That did not belong to our civilization, nor any civilization recognized by the historical record. The chief engineer who found it filed a meticulous 60-page field report. 3 days later, that report vanished. The engineer was permanently erased from federal payrolls, and the gorge was filled with enough concrete to bury a skyscraper. To understand the sheer impossibility of what happened at the Garrison Narrows in the autumn of 1938, you first have to understand the arrogance of the era. The Bureau of Reclamation was not just a government agency, it was an army. They were fresh off the triumph of the Boulder Dam, a project that had tamed the mighty Colorado River and proven that American engineering could subjugate the natural world. They had the money, they had the men, and they had a mandate from Washington to electrify the rural West. The Garrison Narrows was supposed to be a routine project. It was a deep, violently fast tributary of the Snake River, cutting through a sheer basalt canyon. The plan was to build a concrete arch-gravity dam standing 400 feet tall, to control the spring floods and provide hydroelectric power to the isolated farming communities of the high desert. The man chosen to lead the excavation was Elias Vance. Vance was not a politician, and he was not a desk engineer. He was a veteran geologist and a master of earthworks. He had spent his entire life in the mud, breathing rock dust, listening to the agonizing groans of shifting earth. He was a man of absolute, uncompromising precision. His personnel files from the time describe him as brilliant but rigid, a man who trusted mathematics above all other things. He did not believe in myths. He did not believe in mysteries. He believed in load-bearing calculations, tensile strength, and the undeniable truth of bedrock. In April of 1938, Vance arrived at the Narrows with a crew of 600 men. They built a sprawling shantytown of canvas tents and wooden bunkhouses on the high plateau above the canyon. They brought down steam shovels, massive diesel generators, and miles of thick rubber hoses. The noise was deafening. For 24 hours a day, the canyon echoed with the roar of heavy machinery, the screams of the rock crushers, and the constant thundering violence of the river. The first step in building a massive dam is to move the river out of the way. You cannot pour concrete into rushing water. Vance's men spent the first 3 months blasting 2 massive diversion tunnels directly through the solid rock of the canyon walls. They built a temporary cofferdam, a wall of earth and timber, to force the river into these tunnels, leaving the original riverbed dry and exposed. By late August, the river was successfully diverted. The bottom of the canyon, a place that had not seen the sun in thousands of years, was finally revealed. It was a chaotic landscape of scoured boulders, deep potholes, and thick gray mud. But you cannot build a dam on mud. A dam that stands 400 feet high holds back millions of tons of water pressure. If you build it on loose gravel, the water will simply push the dam down the canyon, destroying everything in its path. You must dig down until you reach the bedrock, the solid, unbroken crust of the earth. You must anchor the concrete directly into the bones of the planet. Vance ordered the steam shovels into the dry riverbed. For weeks they dug. They removed thousands of tons of river rock, silt, and ancient debris. They dug down 20 feet, then 40 feet, then 60 feet into the floor of the canyon. The trench became a dark, terrifying place. The walls of the excavation were held back by massive timber braces, constantly weeping water from the subterranean water table. Massive industrial pumps chugged day and night, spitting muddy water out of the trench to keep the men from drowning in the mud. By late September, they hit the bedrock. It was exactly what Vance had expected to find. The Pacific Northwest is defined by the Columbia River Basalt Group. Millions of years ago, massive fissures opened in the earth, and oceans of liquid lava flooded the landscape, cooling into vast, dense layers of black basalt. This rock is incredibly hard, and it was the perfect foundation for a massive concrete structure. Vance's protocol was strict. Once they hit the basalt, they needed to ensure there were no hidden faults, hollow cavities, or weak points in the stone beneath them. He ordered his core drilling teams into the trench. The core drillers used heavy rigs tipped with industrial diamonds. They bored deep, narrow holes into the black stone, extracting cylindrical samples of the rock to bring to the surface for analysis. It was slow, agonizing work. The basalt was unyielding. On the morning of October 4, 1938, the foreman of the drilling crew, a man named Arthur Gable, walked into Vance's field office on the plateau. Gable was a seasoned driller, a man who knew the sound of grinding rock better than the sound of his own wife's voice. He placed a shattered, twisted piece of heavy steel on Vance's desk. It was a diamond-tipped drill bit. It was utterly destroyed. Gable reported that his team, drilling in the dead center of the trench, at a depth of 80 feet below the riverbed, had hit something they could not penetrate. At first, Vance assumed it was a localized anomaly, an inclusion of harder metamorphic rock, perhaps a dense pocket of iron ore. He ordered Gable to swap the bit, move the rig a few feet to the left, and try again. 3 hours later, Gable returned with another ruined drill bit. Vance went down into the trench himself. The air down there was cold and thick with the smell of wet earth and ozone from the electric arc lamps. The noise of the water pumps was a physical pressure against the eardrums. He stood in the mud at the bottom of the world and watched as the drillers set up a third rig. He watched the heavy machinery grind into the black basalt. For the first 20 feet, the drill descended smoothly, pulling up dark, wet stone. And then, at exactly 22 feet into the bedrock, the tone of the drill changed. It stopped screaming and began to whine, a high, sickening pitch of metal, failing against something infinitely harder than itself. The rig shook violently. Smoke poured from the engine. The bit shattered. Vance ordered the drillers to step back. He took a flashlight and peered down the narrow, dark hole. There was nothing to see but muddy water. But he knew, with the instinct of a man who had spent his life reading the earth, that something unnatural was down there. He made a decision that would end his career and perhaps erase his existence. He ordered the men to stop drilling. He ordered them to bring down the heavy explosives. He was going to blow the basalt away and see what was hiding underneath it. The use of explosives at the very bottom of a foundation trench is incredibly dangerous. It risks fracturing the very bedrock you're trying to preserve. But Vance was obsessed. He mapped out a precise grid of small, shaped charges, designed to shatter the top layer of the basalt without sending deep shock waves into the surrounding stone. On October 7th, they cleared the trench and detonated the charges. The blast echoed up the canyon like the roar of a dying god. A massive plume of black dust and water shot into the sky. Before the dust had even settled, Vance was riding the rickety wooden elevator back down into the trench, followed closely by his foreman and a crew of laborers with shovels and pickaxes. The explosive had worked perfectly. It had blown a crater roughly 30 feet wide and 20 feet deep into the solid basalt. The bottom of the crater was filled with pulverized rock and muddy water. Vance ordered the men to clear the debris. They worked in silence, the only sounds the scraping of metal shovels against stone and the relentless throbbing of the water pumps. As they cleared the shattered black rock away, they began to expose something underneath it. It was not rock. At first, the men thought it was a massive sheet of buried steel. As they washed away the mud with high-pressure hoses, the surface was revealed. It was a dull, matte gray material. It did not reflect the harsh glare of the arc lamps. It seemed to absorb the light entirely. Vance dropped to his knees in the mud. He ran his bare hands over the surface. It was perfectly, flawlessly smooth. There were no tool marks. There were no abrasions. It did not feel like metal. It was freezing cold to the touch, yet no condensation formed on its surface. He ordered the men to keep digging outward, expanding the crater to find the edges of the object. For 2 days they labored in the dark trench, blasting and digging away the ancient basalt. But they never found an edge. What they exposed was a section of a wall. It was perfectly vertical, descending endlessly into the earth. It was at least 80 feet long, and there was no indication of where it began or where it ended. It was simply a massive, seamless barrier buried beneath millions of tons of prehistoric rock. The men in the trench became deeply unsettled. These were hardened laborers, men who had seen terrible accidents and brutal conditions, but the sight of that perfectly smooth gray wall beneath the bedrock terrified them. It defied reason. Vance began his testing. He brought down a heavy sledgehammer and swung it against the wall with all his might. When steel strikes stone, there is a sharp crack. When steel strikes steel, there is a ringing vibration. But when Vance struck the gray wall, there was no sound at all. The hammer rebounded with enough force to nearly tear his shoulder from its socket, but the impact produced a dead, flat silence. The material did not absorb the kinetic energy. It completely negated the acoustic wave. He brought down an oxyacetylene cutting torch capable of slicing through inches of solid steel. He held the blue flame directly against the gray surface for 10 minutes. The wall did not melt. It did not scorch. When he turned the torch off and placed his hand on the spot where the flame had been, the material was still freezing cold. It did not conduct heat. It did not react to it at all. Then came the geological impossibility. Vance knew the history of the Earth. He knew that the basalt layer they had blasted through was part of the Columbia River flood basalts. That lava had flowed across the landscape roughly 15 million years ago. If this wall was buried beneath that unbroken layer of ancient lava, it meant the wall had been there before the lava arrived. It meant that 15 million years ago, before humanity existed, before the first primitive apes walked upright, something had built a massive, indestructible structure in the middle of the North American continent. The concept was terrifying. It dismantled the entire foundation of human history in a single, silent stroke. On October 12th, Elias Vance halted all construction on the Garrison Narrows Dam. He ordered the men out of the trench. He posted armed guards at the wooden elevator, instructing them to shoot anyone who attempted to go down into the excavation. He locked himself in his field office. For 48 hours, he did not sleep. He wrote. He drafted what would later be known in whispered rumors among reclamation engineers as Report 404B. According to the few fragmented accounts that survived the era, Report 404B was a masterpiece of desperate engineering logic. Vance documented every test. He included photographs of the shattered drill bits, the blasted crater, and the matte gray surface of the wall. He included the geological core samples, proving the age of the undisturbed basalt above the structure. He calculated the tensile strength of the unknown material to be mathematically infinite based on the equipment he had available. He concluded the report with a stark, terrifying assessment. He stated that the Garrison Narrows Dam could not be built, not because the foundation was weak, but because he could not determine the structural depth of the artificial barrier. Nor could he guarantee that the millions of tons of water pressure from the reservoir would not awaken or disturb whatever lay behind the wall. He sent the report via secure courier train directly to the Secretary of the Interior in Washington, D.C. He expected a panel of scientists to arrive. He expected geological experts from the Smithsonian, physicists from the military, and archaeologists from the great universities. He expected the site to become the most important scientific discovery in the history of the world. That is not what happened. 4 days after the report was dispatched, a train arrived at the desolate rail spur near the construction camp. It did not carry scientists. It carried a battalion of soldiers from the United States Army Corps of Engineers, accompanied by 24 men in dark, unmarked wool suits. They did not speak to the laborers. They did not answer questions. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. The men in suits entered Vance's field office. They seized his files, his blueprints, his notebooks, and his photographic negatives. They dismantled his radio equipment. When Vance demanded to know under whose authority they were operating, he was simply handed a single piece of paper, signed by the Secretary of War. It declared the Garrison Narrows project a matter of absolute national security. The 600 laborers were immediately rounded up. They were given their final paychecks in cash, loaded onto military transport trucks, and threatened with federal prison under the Espionage Act if they ever spoke of what they had seen in the trench. Within hours, the bustling, noisy shantytown was emptied. Only Vance, his foreman Gable, and the military personnel remained. Vance watched from the rim of the canyon as the Army engineers took control of the heavy machinery. They did not go down into the trench to study the wall. They went down to destroy the evidence. But they could not destroy it. The military engineers realized quickly what Vance already knew. The wall could not be blasted. It could not be drilled. It could not be moved. So they buried it. The orders were absolute and immediate. They did not even bother to remove the steam shovels, the water pumps, or the arc lamps from the bottom of the trench. They simply began pouring concrete. For 7 days and 7 nights, a fleet of cement mixer trucks rolled out to the edge of the canyon. They poured thousands of tons of heavy industrial concrete directly down into the excavation. They buried the crater. They buried the matte gray wall. They buried the abandoned machinery. They filled the trench all the way back up to the original riverbed, sealing the anomaly beneath a massive, permanent plug of artificial stone. Once the concrete was set, the military engineers blew up the wooden cofferdams. With a deafening roar, the diverted river violently reclaimed its original path. Millions of gallons of dark, freezing water rushed back into the canyon, flowing directly over the massive concrete seal, burying the site beneath 70 feet of roaring rapids. The Garrison Narrows Dam was never completed. The project was officially listed as abandoned due to unstable geological fault lines. The blueprints were archived, the budgets were reallocated, and Elias Vance vanished. There are no records of his employment with the Bureau of Reclamation after October of 1938. He did not go on to build other dams. He did not retire to a quiet life in the suburbs. His pension was never collected. According to the census records of 1940, Elias Vance simply ceased to exist. His foreman, Arthur Gable, died in a sudden single-car automobile accident on a dry, straight road in Nevada 3 months later. The government was incredibly thorough. They scoured the archives, erasing the very concept of the anomaly from the public record. But bureaucratic systems are rarely perfect. Small inconsistencies remain. Supply orders for diamond drill bits that were never returned. Military transport logs showing massive movements of concrete to a site that officially required none. And that single chilling map in the Department of the Interior where the river simply stops, labeled with the desperate command to seal the trench. For nearly 90 years, the river has flowed over that spot. The canyon remains silent, isolated, and untouched. The local fishermen who navigate those dark waters complain of strange occurrences. They say their magnetic compasses spin wildly when they pass over the Narrows. They say that in the dead of winter, when the water is low, they can hear a deep rhythmic vibration echoing through the ice. Water, a sound that does not belong to the rushing river. A sound like a massive subterranean engine endlessly churning deep beneath the earth. What did Elias Vance uncover in the mud of the Pacific Northwest? Was it simply an impossible geological formation, a bizarre trick of heat and pressure that formed a smooth, glass-like sheet of rock? The government has buried natural anomalies before to save face and hide their own engineering failures. Was it the remnant of a civilization that existed on this planet millions of years before we did? A structure built by hands that were not human, designed to withstand the brutal, crushing weight of geological time? Or was it something else entirely, something that was not built to keep the Earth out, but to keep something else in? Something that the government realized was too dangerous to touch, too terrifying to acknowledge, and too massive to destroy. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply a series of accidents exaggerated by exhausted men in a dangerous place. Or maybe the people who lived through it saw something we no longer recognize.